Welcome to online.ua. Today, we will talk about the involvement of the Belarusian regime in the deportation of Ukrainian children, about the change in Lukashenko's rhetoric, and about the political situation and mood in Belarus, with the deputy head of the United Transitional Cabinet of Belarus, head of the National Anti-Crisis Management Pavel Latushka. Pavel, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
The self-proclaimed president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, said that he was absent from the media space due to his illness, and he called the discussion of his condition nothing more than a rumor in messengers and telegraph channels. What is going on now in Belarus on the news about Lukashenko's illness?
Lukashenko is really sick. Sick on the part we will not talk about. But he is also ill physically. His problems are also connected with his age. Though, from the point of view of European, American standards, it is not such a big age. But accumulated problems are catching up with him. They are first of all related to the last viral disease he got. And he confessed yesterday, even named the diagnosis. But this viral illness rather involves going to the same place very often. So he decided to publicly disclose it. It is his right to reveal his personal problems. But we also know that he has a problem with his knee joint and his spine. It requires surgery. And it has been an accumulated problem for some time. But he is afraid. Imagine that there are 5,000 vacancies for doctors in Belarus. Because the most massive repressions in the country over the last many years in Europe, the most massive repressions in the last 40-50 years, have happened in the medical sphere as well. By the way, yesterday, he had a meeting with medics where he was talking about his disease, among other things. He is afraid to have an operation in Belarus because it is not certain that he will be able to walk after it. If he goes to Moscow, the fears come to him because there it is not certain that after anesthesia he will wake up. If we talk about going to a third country, in principle, he is afraid. Because of those elections that he lost with a bang in 2020, and he started repressions, because of the war he started together with Russia against Ukraine, he is very much afraid of everything now. That is why he is postponing his operations. We know he is of course obese. We can see that he has a lot of weight. He needs to lose weight. His glucose is elevated. He has to take pills almost every day to lower his blood sugar. So these problems are accumulated. To say that this will lead to some kind of fatality at some point, sooner or later, it will all come. But to bet on that scenario would be the wrong approach. That is why we are coming from a proactive policy, a policy of action, to eliminate this regime, rather than waiting for it to play out in a box.
About what's going on with all the news about his illness in Belarus. Do you notice any changes in people's attitudes? His supporters even, for example?
He actually announced in 2021 that there was an assassination attempt on him. He is fond of telling where the assassination attempt came from. He told about the cellars in the Gomel region. He almost showed these cellars where terrorists were hiding, who wanted to eliminate him and his children. And after this statement, he declared and signed a decree in case of his violent death. Everyone, of course, flinched and thought he's planning something. It turned out later, he made further amendments to the constitution, wrote it himself, voted for it and signed it himself. Because there was no referendum, nobody voted for this constitution. It clearly states that in the event of his normal death, the chairman of the upper house of parliament will temporarily become the head of state. In the event of a violent death, then the Security Council will act. In these cases, it is the head of parliament who chairs the Security Council. But there used to be a story that the second person in the country was the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister moved to the third role, although it is not spelled out in any way. So maybe he is there 20 or 30, but there is no third option. There is a Security Council, and there are 11 generals in that Security Council. We understand that they will play the key role in any scenario. Either he dies or he is helped to do so by generals who have blood on their hands and who will do everything to keep this power, because criminal liability awaits them. Because on the other hand, the factor of Russia will play. This is a key factor because the only country which has a strategy today, what to do with Belarus, what to do with Lukashenko's regime, is the Russian Federation. Nobody, neither Western partners nor American partners, unfortunately, have this strategy. There is our strategy of democratic forces, but, again, we understand that without the support of external partners, it will be difficult enough to implement, but that does not mean that we will not act. So the scenario is already scripted by the man himself, no matter how surprising that would be. But one must understand that this is a man who will cling to power until his last day. Unfortunately, I have had the opportunity to communicate with him. He cannot see his life without power. Yes, there is another scenario that he has also envisaged. It's like he's laying eggs in different baskets to confuse everyone. One of the scenarios is the so-called conditional transit. For example, he becomes the chairman of the Supreme Council or the Presidium of the All Belarusian People's Assembly, the SNC so-called. The question is, will he transfer all his powers there? Because if he passes to that position, I can't imagine that he will leave his powers to manage armed forces, security forces, for example, to the president, which he will not be. So this transit is also a scenario, but we can find out how real it is in the near future.
Following the information that Lukashenko was to meet with Putin in Moscow today, 24 of May, to discuss problems in the relations between Belarus and Russia. In your opinion, what problems do they discuss there? And what will they achieve? How do they plan to resolve them? What will the meeting lead to?
Look, money and guarantees and money. That's all Lukashenko's interested in. Guarantees to keep him in power. After all, he received these guarantees from Putin in 2020 in August, when 1 million Belarusians marched all over the country in cities, district centers, villages, in Minsk, in all regional cities. He received guarantees from Putin, but he was also given a corresponding task, which he had to do. And now he is selling Belarus to Russia in pieces, sovereignty, independence, and money. He is interested in money, because if there is no money, he will not be able to retain, as a usurper, the part of power that is left to him from what he has not yet managed to give to Putin. So, conventionally speaking, he can run the administrative apparatus today, hold meetings with the Ministry of Health, and threaten to sack everyone. Why would Putin do that? If we are talking about the armed forces, they are practically under the direct control, protectorate of the Russian Federation, General Staff of the Armed Forces of Russia, Federal Security Service of Russia, Secretary of Security Council Patrushev. So it's been under control for a long time. So these are two topics. I think they will certainly discuss the topic of import substitution. This is a recurring theme, but it is very clear and understandable. We were talking about it as soon as Lukashenko and Putin started publicizing it, that we are talking about import substitution for the military-industrial complex, and the latest publications confirm it. For example, the statement of Lukashenko's ambassador to Russia, Dmitry Krutoy. We have a very tough ambassador in Russia. His surname is Krutoy. He speaks about cooperation in the military-industrial complex, like the Kalashnikov factory, or the Russian enterprise Almaz-Antey, together with the Gomel tank factory, to produce machine tools to produce weapons in the Russian Federation. This is not just one example. There are hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of such examples. Russia has allocated serious enough resources for Lukashenko to rebuild the country's economy in the direction of militarization. Therefore, last week, chairman of Lukashenko's Military-Industrial Committee, Dmitry Pantas, who was present at the signing in Machulishchi, by the way. Remember, when Shuig suddenly flew in on Saturday night, there was a signing with Cronin, the defense minister. He said that we are ready to fulfill any order from the Russian Federation in the interests of the Russian armed forces. So the question arises, are we going to play with Lukashenko or not to pay attention to him? What is he doing? He trains Russian troops. He produces arms. He gets profits for it. Money. He evades sanctions because the European Union has not imposed sanctions against Lukashenko for a year. And this is such a multi-directional, incomprehensible policy. Lack of strategy leads to the fact that Lukashenko is doing everything that Putin needs. The only question is what Putin would expect at some stage, an entry by land of armed forces, an attempt to enter, shall we say, in the direction of Ukraine.
But at the same time, Lukashenko said recently that he does not plan to personally participate in the St. Petersburg Economic Forum to be held in December. I think Dmitry Krutoy will go. Why is there such ambiguity in his actions? He is going to Moscow now. But then he says he will not be there personally at the International Economic Forum afterwards.
There is no contradiction here. I don't think so. Knowing the procedure of preparation of documents to justify Lukashenko's trip, wherever it is, a justification is written and it says what level the event will be and with whom meetings are planned. And here is the question: who will be at this economic forum in St. Petersburg? I don't think that world leaders will be there. That's the first thing. The second point is whether he is going to meet with Putin again. Well, he is meeting with him today, and he has a meeting with Putin tomorrow. Just a few days later, he will have another meeting with him. What is the point? It looks a little bit incomprehensible. Let us not forget the story that in the 1990s, Lukashenko, as a young leader of Belarus, had been to Davos for the first time, perhaps the only real time that he had won the elections. And then in Switzerland, he had a public conflict with foreign journalists who attacked him very seriously for repressions inside the country and for breaking up the parliament. I remember that the ambassador of Belarus to Switzerland, permanent representative in Geneva Ogatsov, was subsequently fired for this situation. Lukashenko has been very afraid of any forums ever since, very afraid of public discussions, and he tries to avoid them. Yes, maybe now he meets somewhere within the framework of the Eurasian Union, but I do not remember him going to such events, with very rare exceptions. He always sent the Prime Minister, or the Deputy Prime Minister, or the Ambassador. It was always his decision. No one ever managed to convince him to go to any public forum where questions would be asked head-on. Of course, it is hardly conceivable that he would be asked a critical question in St. Petersburg, but he does not feel very comfortable in these situations. He probably remembers that Swiss story, and the main logic is, why should we meet again in a few days? That is, he will not be able to sell it inside the Belarusian society. There will be no result.
One of the most important issues, which is probably the subject of much discussion, is there a possible coup d'état in the country in the backdrop of all these events?
In Belarus? If we are talking about the people around him, they are not capable of making a coup. They are the people that are loyal to him, devoted to both him and Russia at the same time. And they see their preservation, the status quo that they have now. The longer Lukashenko is in power, the longer they will not be held criminally responsible nationally due to changes in Belarus or internationally, such as the tribunal in The Hague or the tribunal created for the facts of aggression. Therefore, it does not make sense for them to make any kind of coup. Is it necessary for the Russian Federation today? In my opinion, it is not necessary either. After all, Lukashenko does for the most part what Putin wants him to do today. And if he fulfills this function, even if he is not doing it in some part, it is not because he is so cunning and dexterous, because Russia is not pushing him as it should be, or again sees no sense in it. After all, it is not in the interests of the Russian Federation to create some problems on the territory of Belarus. This is why today, at the international conference in Warsaw, I said that there may be a completely different strategy. The most powerful sanctions, which may be imposed on Russia, are the liquidation of Lukashenko's regime. Because the problems with Lukashenko in Belarus is a trigger of problems for Russia, it is Russia's need for problems inside Belarus. And now they need all these resources for what? To go to war against Ukraine. Therefore, by weakening Lukashenko, we are weakening Russia, because then it has to infuse more resources to support him. Today, Russia is not following the principle of annexation. Russia is following an accelerated evolutionary path. It wants to change Belarusian society in a couple of years, hold a referendum, and then incorporate Belarus into the Russian Federation. This scenario is prescribed by the Kremlin. I do not have the slightest doubt about it. There were some insides about it, by the way. But maybe Russia will need Belarus as a UN member that will have a voice and will be one of those 5-6 voices that vote in favor of the Russian Federation at the UN. Why should they lose this vote? Therefore, such profanation of the state will also benefit the Russian Federation.
About what Lukashenko does or does not do on Putin's orders. Recently, Russian airplanes and drones practically do not take off from the territory of Belarus. I understand that you may not be able to comment on this situation because you are not a military expert, but still, in your opinion, what can it be connected to? Is it because Putin pushed him to do so, or for any other reason?
In terms of military strategy, of course, I'm not a military strategist either, but it's probably logical for Russia, and it's unambiguously 100%. There's no doubt about it, to have the territory of Belarus under control. It's a bridgehead that goes inside Europe, which is surrounded by EU and NATO member states, from which a very negative and horrific strike was launched in the direction of Kiev in February 2022. So it is beneficial for Russia to have this bridgehead. And just as we return with you to the strategy, do our European partners understand that by not paying attention to this problem, it is kind of postponing the whole issue of changing the security situation in this region of Europe in general? Because the victory of Ukraine, in which we believe, in which we help as much as we can, will happen. But if there is no change in Belarus, it will be a permanent critical problem. So there is a benefit. Why are there no strikes? I would probably try to guess that today, if it was coming from the territory of Belarus, it would fly back. If it would fly back, it could also be a trigger within Belarusian society. The active part of the Belarusians, who clearly understand what is happening today in Ukraine, who is guilty of this war, can react to it, including by actions inside the country against this regime. Again, it does not benefit Lukashenko, but it does not benefit the Russian Federation either. Today, the Secretary of State of the Security Council, whom we often recall, Wolfowitz, said that we are for peace and let us use Belarus as a negotiation platform. This is such an illusion. I can't imagine that today there would be negotiations in Minsk or anywhere in Belarus. What kind of peace can we talk about if we know the clear position of Ukraine, the liberation of the territories, and then we can talk? And on the other hand, who is going to negotiate today in Belarus, which is, from the point of view of international law, the aggressor, which is involved in the illegal movement of Ukrainian children, which produces weapons, trains Russian servicemen at training ranges around the clock for more than a year? Therefore, this scenario can be laid as well. We do not inflict missile strikes in order to sell the thesis, Belarus is a peaceful country, and we are for peace in general. Well, it is a fool's errand, frankly speaking, because in fact, it is not confirmed in any way.
Lukashenko's stance on the West. Last year in March, we all remember how he told us where the attack on Belarus was going to take place. The dictator has repeatedly stated that the West is allegedly planning to attack Russia, and the Belarusian servicemen have to prevent this war. How much has Lukashenko's rhetoric changed now? Perhaps there is something new? Or does he continue to say the same thing in different words?
The last thing he said was that there will be no counteroffensive. That is, he continues in the narrative to support Russia wherever possible. But you are right that the attack on the territory of Belarus from the west has not been heard of lately. He must be ill, his voice is weakened, his nerves are giving out. He is getting frightened. Psychologically, he is now in the most difficult situation since the war they have unleashed together with Russia against Ukraine. He is afraid of a counteroffensive. It makes him afraid. He is just a coward. And he has this fear prevailing today. That is why he is afraid to express these theses. That is the first argument. The second argument, they probably have already written down the propagandists. It is impossible to talk about the same thing for more than a year. They are preparing to attack us. Poland wants to conquer Belarus. Half of it, then the whole country. The Americans have deployed divisions in Lithuania and Poland. Now they are attacking Belarus, etc. They were selling this legend to the society as if trying to create a threat. Look, we are for peace, and someone wants to attack us. But I understand that the propagandists have written off This narrative goes no further than that. After all, they also do sociological polls for real. Therefore, this rhetoric has gone out of Lukashenko's mouth, but it is present in the words of the military. The same Ukrainian says, the Minister of Defense, so-called, in threats. And Wolfowitz brings it up. But Lukashenko has really bitten his tongue. He has been silent about it lately.
One of the most important topics for Ukraine today remains Russia's war crimes, in particular the kidnapping of Ukrainian children. You recently presented a report in Strasbourg that shows the involvement of the Belarusian regime in the illegal deportation and interrogation of Ukrainian children. Can you tell us more in detail? Is the number of children taken to the territory of Belarus known in general? Is their place of stay known? Let's talk about it in more detail.
First of all, of course, these are Ukrainian children. They are citizens of Ukraine. We proceed from the position that, first of all, we should inform the Ukrainian authorities about the crimes committed by Lukashenko and his colleagues. Let us say, accomplices in the context of war crimes. We have informed the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, and on May 8, we received a reply that the Prosecutor General's office was conducting a preliminary investigation into the illegal transfer of Ukrainian children both to the territory of Russia and to the territory of the Republic of Belarus. This is an official response based on the report we prepared and submitted to the Office of the Prosecutor General. We also pass the information through diplomatic channels to the Ukrainian side, because these are Ukrainian children in the first place. Of course, we subsequently informed international structures, the European Parliament in Strasbourg, the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. By the way, due to the joint interaction with Ukrainian deputies, a resolution was adopted in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which included amendments concerning Lukashenko's role in this. Subsequently, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, as Bogdan Yeremenko, a deputy of the Verkhovna Rada, said, on the basis and our information prepared amendments to the resolution to the address of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, where the role of Lukashenko in need to bring him to justice was specified separately, and the Republic of Belarus was added to the Russian Federation. Among other things, it is our small merit that in Reykjavik, at the highest political summit of the Council of Europe, the fact of transfer of Ukrainian children to the territory of Belarus was spelled out. We have identified the persons responsible for these actions concretely. We know how many children, 2,150 children for the last year, until the end of May of this year. We know about the plans of the Lukashenko regime, how many children they are planning to transfer. We focus first of all on children from 6 to 15 years old, orphans. And we have confirmed the facts of concrete children. We pass all this to the Ukrainian side, and we will also pass it to the Office of Prosecutor Khan of the International Criminal Court. So we know the places where Ukrainian children are, where they are moved. There were 3 places. There are already 4. 3 in Minsk region, 1 in Gomel region, specific names, organizations, founders, foundations, the Russian Dolphins Foundation, the Belarusian Ally Foundation. We know that they go to the territory of Ukraine. They are engaged in taking Ukrainian children. We know that they are engaged in re-education. They change their mentality. They are told that both Biden and Zelensky must be liquidated, and that there is no legitimate power in Ukraine, that it is usurped power. That is, they are working with them, methodically and systematically. Propagandists, the so-called artists from Lukashenko's pool, paramilitary organizations for children, the Night Wolves, a well-known Russian organization. In other words, they process and process Ukrainian children. It's as if your child was taken away from you and returned after some time, but at the same time, you were told what a bad parent you are. And this child is not your own. It does not love you. It just hates you. This is the goal Lukashenko is setting. Not only that, this is the goal he sets. We have facts when they promise to educate Ukrainian children in Belarus, and they will offer them to work as miners at Belaruskali. In other words, sorry, this is slavery. This is the use of children as a labor force. Lukashenko signed all these documents, very curiously, in Moscow, as chairman of the Supreme State Council of the Union State. He signs resolutions with his signature, number, date, city of Moscow. He has been dreaming of sitting in Moscow, so he is signing his own verdict, sitting in Moscow. We know how many resources are allocated from the Union State budget. We know the name of programs under which all this is being done. We know what resources are allocated by Belaruskali for the removal of Ukrainian children. That is, we have collected a lot of materials. Politicians are interested in a part of the report. Many ambassadors and foreign ministries have come to us with requests to share this information. Of course, the world agencies, today Reuters, also published a material referring to our report, referring to the General Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine. We have to stop it. This public factual information should stop it. Next, by identifying the individuals, we must help bring Ukrainian children back to Ukraine. And the next thing is those who have committed war crimes. We have a top-class group of lawyers who graduated from the Geneva Academy of Public International Law, specialists in military law.
Just about the sentence. There is evidence. There are all his signatures. Putin and Maria Lvova have already received a warrant from the International Criminal Court. As for Lukashenko, how realistic and feasible is it for the International Criminal Court to also issue a warrant for him? For example, since 2014, since the beginning of the war, Putin has been abducting children, but he received the warrant not long ago. How soon will Lukashenko be punished?
As a lawyer, I think that if there are already proceedings underway, which the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has started, that is, the case is already underway. The case identifies officials suspected of, shall we say, war crimes. One of the suspects may be Lukashenko. There are relevant documents, facts and materials for that. The assessment of these facts and materials is, of course, the absolute prerogative of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Only he can make an assessment whether this evidence is sufficient or not. Our lawyers believe that this evidence is absolutely sufficient to talk about, including Lukashenko as a suspect in the investigation. If he is included in this investigation as a suspect, the next fact is the issuing of an arrest warrant. But again, this is the decision of Prosecutor Khan. We have no right to press him or persuade him. He will assess on the basis of facts. I'm even sure that it's not just us, but other organizations, including our partners in the democratic forces, that are helping us to gather this information. There are a lot of people. There are photos and videos, and even independent investigators have joined. We have our share of materials. But I am convinced that both the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine and the investigation that is underway have even more materials in connection with these circumstances. If we accumulate all these materials, it means that we will have much more evidence, and the prosecutor in The Hague will make the procedural legal decision. This is our goal. And as the second stage, we see reporting on the crimes against humanity committed by the Lukashenko regime against the Belarusian people. And all these crimes, despite the fact that Lukashenko has not signed the Rome Statute. He knew, he's a cunning man, he knew what he was committing. Years ago, he understood how he was going to rule in Belarus. So we have enough evidence too. We will offer clear legal tools to the International Criminal Court to bring Lukashenko to justice. But the decision is already up to the prosecutor. I hope that it will be made, but it is his right. Once again,
Tell me, please, at this moment the deportation of Ukrainian children to the territory of Belarus continues? What is known about it?
yes, it goes on. New groups are arriving, and they arrive literally in May. We even know the schedule of how many children, in what numbers, arrive on the territory of Belarus, including in Camp Dubrava. Of course, we have to consider it in two parts. On the one hand, there are children who leave, for example, with their mothers, with their parents, but there are orphans who are citizens of Ukraine, and only the father and the mother, which is Ukraine, can decide whether they want to leave the territory or not. This is why we are focusing on orphans and children from problematic social families, when a child can be taken away from their parents under the guise that we will send them to a health resort and then not return them, or return them not to Ukraine, but to the territory of the Russian Federation. We know the logistics of how it goes through the Russian Federation to Belarus and then back to the Russian Federation. Some of them go back to Ukraine, to the occupied territory. Some stay on the territory of the Russian Federation. But this is, of course, the subject of additional investigative actions. This is still a huge amount of work that we and the investigators who lead these cases need to do.
We have not yet talked about the return of children back to Ukraine. Are there any cases of children being taken back home from Belarus?
Yes, if we are talking about those who left with their parents or by authority, yes, these children, as far as we understand, come back. If we are talking about orphan children, this is not always the case. Again, from the point of view of the International Criminal Court and the law in general, it is impossible not to be held liable for a crime committed. You are sitting, for example, in a cafe. There is a child next to you. He is taken from you and taken away for 2 weeks and returned 2 weeks later. Was there a crime? Yes, you don't know where your child is for 2 weeks. Did you consent to this? No, you didn't. So even temporary relocation is a crime, and it qualifies as a war crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. We shouldn't overestimate what we can do. We're not a prosecutor's office or an investigation committee. It is very difficult for us. We operate with the information we gather in the publishers, non-public information, which comes to us thanks to our partners, our communication channels, investigators who help us to uncover even schemes. We know who is giving what orders to whom, and on this basis, we build our public part of the report and the non-public part of the report, which we do not provide to our partners, for the simple reason that we are talking about the safety of children, and this cannot be done because the main thing is the children. The main thing is to get them back. The main thing is to understand their fate, what is happening to them now, and how to return them to Ukraine and the legitimate Ukrainian authorities.
On June 1st, the world will mark International Day for the Protection of Children. In your opinion, after all we have talked about and looked at all of Russia's atrocities, and not only hers, can we say that the world has failed on this day?
Yes, it is likely to be a sad day on the examples of the treatment of Ukrainian children by the Russian Federation, the illegitimate authorities in Belarus. It is terrible, and we understand it. Yes, it will be one of the most difficult days in the history of celebrating Children's Day. Let's look on the other side as well. Belarusian children. After all, we have a huge number of examples of child rights violations in Belarus. 9 out of at least 5,000 political prisoners in our country are minors. The youngest one is 15 years old, and they are convicted and criminal cases are lodged against them. We have examples when a child is taken as a hostage and held in a Belarusian prison, blackmailing relatives. There are cases when both parents are imprisoned and the children are left alone. It is good when some relatives or acquaintances manage to take them out of the flat or try to take them somewhere. Young children are left without parents who are sentenced to 5-6 years imprisonment. And the regime does not care that these are small children, that they are 6, 7, 8 years old. And how will they live without both parents? Here is the example of Olga Zolotai. The girl did not do anything illegal. She was just organizing a tea party in a village near Minsk, where I used to live. She has 5 children, 5 underage children. She was convicted, imprisoned for 5 years. And all attempts by human rights organizations, even the Vatican tried to help free her, were unsuccessful. She was deprived of her right to raise her 5 children. This is a disaster. This is a question for those on whom the instruments of international law depend. Why, when you see such horror happening around the world, towards children in Europe, the part of a more civilized world, why don't you use these instruments of responsibility? And this is very important. Otherwise, we would slide into complete anarchy, when really anyone can have a child taken away and never be punished.
We believe and hope that everyone involved in atrocities, not only in the military, and not only in Ukraine, will be punished in the near future. Thank you for our conversation today.
Thank you.
Today, we had an interview with Deputy Head of the United Transitional Cabinet of Belarus, Head of the National Anti-Crisis Management Pavel Latushka, at online.ua. And I would like to remind you to subscribe to online.ua YouTube channel and press the bell not to miss new interesting videos.